very good afternoon, morning, or evening to you, and welcome to this edition of A Reason for Hope. Sean Richards hosting today, joined by the Burrito for our infamous Apologetics Monday. At the time of this recording, at least, it is Monday, so we are taking it on, as the Lord has called us, to discuss matters pertaining to giving an answer for the reason for the hope that is within us. And that differs from what we do any other day of the week, mainly because we'll be focusing in on one specific subject and one specific topic. Today, that is atheism and the issue of divine hiddenness. Have you ever seen God? So if you've ever encountered people who would put this forward, politely or otherwise, we will be taking this time to, of course, inform you as much as we can how to respond politely or otherwise to this issue. But note that along with everything else that we are setting aside this time for, it is also to answer your Bible questions. So like any other day of the week, if we have time left over in addressing this topic in detail, you can still get your questions to us and we'll be happy to answer them. First of all, if you want to join us on YouTube, we are live streaming at A Reason, the number 4 Hope. The comment sections are available for your questions anytime, and as long as they are sincere, we will be happy to address them on the broadcast. Facebook is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson. That is our home fellowship, and you can leave your questions in the comments or our inbox and join us live in the live chat. Our Twitter page or X platform is SCOTTR4H. Tweet us your questions at ScottR4H, and we'll be happy to get to your questions where and when possible. And then lastly, we are live streaming on our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com. Click on the Watch Live tab and you'll be able to join us face-to-face, but also noting that when we are not live, you can still email us your questions at questions@areason4hope.org. So when we are obviously taking the time to discuss matters pertaining to God's Word, we want to involve Him as much in the process as possible. So let's start with the word of prayer and then get into today's topic on Apologetics Monday. Dad, thank you for the honor and opportunity you've given us to be in your word among your people, and I'm asking to be in your spirit. Allow us to not only be grace seasoned with salt in how we give these answers, but to be diligent in showing ourselves approved, to be able to give an answer for the reason for the hope that is within us. We know that you're more interested in guiding people to you than we are oftentimes in seeking that guidance, and I pray that that duality itself will serve as something that settles the hearts and ultimately quiets the minds of many that bring up this objection to your character. Whether it's sincere or otherwise, allow us to be able to give an answer. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, without further ado, divine hiddenness. Atheism has a lot in common with modern cult groups in their criticism of God. And I don't just mean this in approach of tactics where they try to appeal to giving you a status of superiority in this subculture or group as long as you parrot exactly what we say, but meaning that they oftentimes will just take what they see other groups criticizing without actually understanding the substance and then putting that forward as if they've discovered something new that Christians haven't already answered before. For example, Christians have to deal with false teachings within their own group all the time. Jehovah's Witnesses or modern-day Arians will misrepresent the Trinity in order to condemn it. Muslims will then, say for example, borrow these arguments in order to follow through on a similar issue the Quran makes, though not the mistakes of Arians in modern-day Jehovah's Witnesses, but because the Quran never properly understood what the Trinity was, so they want a better argument against Christianity, so they will go to Jehovah's Witnesses in the same way. Unitarians, for example, will demand of Christians a standard that their own beliefs wouldn't survive, and it would usually go something like this. Categorically, the Trinity is a logical impossibility because it's saying God is three in the same sense that he is one. You have to pick one or the other. The Christian response is that the Trinity isn't claiming God is three in the same sense as he is one. He's three in person, but one in essence. Those are two different senses. The concept is unique, but of course, despite being multi-personal, the argument needs to be clarified as a result of the answer. It's a fundamental misrepresentation of the belief to accuse us of being in conflict with logic when they have logically misrepresented what we mean by the Trinity. And most logical circles, they call this a straw man, but we won't go that route. The idea is, again, to say that just like with Muslims who have to parrot off of arguments of others, most atheists, when they try to level arguments against Christianity, they don't get that far as their criticisms are concerned. Their rejection isn't of what God is like, but the idea of God itself. The concept is what they're trying to critique. So ideas about it would be irrelevant. And in the days of the internet meme, it's important when engaging in meaningful conversations that you can communicate effectively while being as brief as possible. We all suffer from goldfish attention spans, so it at least can be given that much grace. And unfortunately, to be able to give briefer and more substantive answers, this requires a lot more preparation than just memorizing a zinger or two and getting into a mindless exchange of, well, this is my meme and this is your meme and one slogan after another. You have to listen to their objections in order to properly identify the mistake. And just like with Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, and Unitarians regarding the Trinity, to address that mistake correctly as to whether or not they're lying to you or just misinformed is also going to be just as important when responding. And only then can the conversation perhaps move on to better things like misunderstanding or misrepresentation that would shatter their own worldview if applied consistently. This is one that we've again all heard before. If you've had any meaningful conversations with atheists, if God is real, have you ever seen him? Now, the argument can be broken down a number of different ways, but understand that just like with the Trinity, there's a fundamental misrepresentation or misunderstanding in this. So in order to effectively respond, it's probably helpful to kind of break this down into math. And this isn't by handing them their argument and pulling, the Kathy Newman. So you're saying, but asking the question, what are you claiming by arguing this? Some examples in debates that we've watched would essentially break down to two claims. First, real things are things that you can see, and God isn't something that you can see. So therefore, God isn't real. The argument is the second formal law of logic. A does not equal non-A. Real is what is seen. God is not seen, therefore God is not real. Now, there's a few problems if this is something that they would agree to, if, of course, arguing from this position. The first and most important is that there are real things that you can't see. For example, wind, the laws of chemistry and physics, the law of logic that this argument is based on, and others. And the best way to illustrate this, and I don't recommend the, faith, it's all just about this. No, we're talking about tangible things that they would acknowledge. And atheists try to set their camp up in the science category. So if they respect that, maybe use one of those as an example. For instance, do you believe in the law of logic? Do you believe in logic itself? Have you ever seen logic? Well, hopefully they will see that if that means logic doesn't exist, I would be using logic to conclude that, and then they'd say, okay, I can't see a transcendent concept that governs reality like logic. But even then, they may still insist that empiricism, things that pertain to the senses, are what they would take seriously as regards to evidence for God. And this, again, is also flawed because reality itself isn't based on what you can see. You not seeing something doesn't mean it's not there. For example, camouflage. The goal is that they are there, but you can't see them, at least not right away. If I have never met someone in my life, I don't bring them to existence as far as my interactions with them. They may not be relevant to my life if I have never met them, but their existence does not depend on me observing them. They can live their entire lives. That could actually happen in its fullness, and I have never seen them. So noting that their interactions with my observations, which is the standard for truth in this case, wouldn't determine their existence in arguing this. The same thing is for places I've never visited. I don't travel that much, so as far as I'm concerned, an overwhelming majority of this world doesn't exist. Yet it exists regardless of my interaction with it or not. You can use many illustrations in order to set the point home. The tree falls in the forest, no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound, that kind of reasoning. But reality, once again, isn't based on what you see. That can, in fact, exist independent from you. And finally, if we get down to brass tacks, we can get into a more meaningful conversation of the fact people in history have claimed to have seen God. The fact they aren't one of them doesn't debunk these claims. For example, Jesus of Nazareth said that he was, of course, the Father made flesh, or not the Father made flesh, but the Father's glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, made flesh. The apostles saw Jesus, whom they noted as God the Son. Adam interacted with God and his wife in the cool of the day in the Garden of Eden. Abraham had several meals with the Lord when he visited him. Hagar interacted with the God who sees her. We can talk about Jacob in his vision of the famous ladder at Bethel. We can talk about Moses at Mount Sinai. We can talk about Joshua and his interaction with the commander of the army of the Lord. We can talk about Samson's parents having seen God and didn't die. Solomon and his multiple visions that resulted in him being given wisdom. We could go beyond Christianity and talk about the avatars interacting in Hindu circles and traditions. We can talk about Joseph Smith's false prophecy regarding the first vision, where he saw a visual representation of the Son and Father. We can ask the average crackhead at 7-Eleven, and he claims to see God quite a bit. And, of course, in memes, the dog from Bush's Baked Beans commercials. But obviously, we don't believe all of these claims, and I just want to note that. But it's on a case-by-case basis that we need to examine these claims, just like these bad arguments. If someone said they saw God, I'd want to know about it. If I have no reason to trust them, then, of course, I'm going to be less willing to listen until I see some evidence. That's hopefully the same attitude and mindset that the atheist genuinely has, and we'll note genuinely here in a few moments. But the issue is ultimately asking the question about relevance. If someone says, well, you haven't seen God, therefore you have no reason to believe he exists, well, that's getting into, I should say, a more productive conversation, and that would be another way they could argue. The first claim would be, you have never seen God, and the second claim would be, you only have reason to believe something exists if you can see it. The conclusion then would be, you have no reason to believe God exists, that your beliefs are unreasonable. The argument is the same as the first, but it's adjusting the factors a little bit. And again, you can bring them through different conversations, and if there are any atheists listening, perhaps you can format your questions for us in a similar way. But the argument is all stemming from A does not equal non-A. A is what I'm looking for, God is non-A. Therefore, it's not what I care about. It's not what I could know. Well, there's, again, the same problems, because like we talked about before, there are more ways to know something exists apart from seeing it. For example, I don't observe my memories in any tangible sense. They are stored in my brain, but my past experiences, and even more significantly, the experience of others, can solidify that. I could know something exists by trusting, note that, the experience of others, given reasons to trust them. If I observe history and I know the standards by which to judge it, people can make stuff up in history, but just because they can doesn't mean they have. And if my argument is to ask the question, what have people seen in history? That's what history is based on, the eyewitness testimony of others. What reasons do I have to trust them? Is it an early source? Do more than one person say the same basic thing about the same basic details? Do they admit to things they would have to acknowledge rather than to embellish? Is there, in fact, more reason to believe this is said at the time that it was claimed as opposed to when it wasn't? And on it goes. But even the atheist would acknowledge there's things that they could know exist without ever having seen it. The scientific laws we mentioned earlier regarding physics, chemistry, and more are all centered around these ideas. You don't see these things because they're governing transcendent principles, not actual tangible things in the universe. There's no central core of the laws of physics that you could touch and it'll burn your hand because it's just so science fiction-y. No, these things are real. They do impact the real world, but they then of themselves are not tangible. And to argue that I have never seen something gives me no reason to believe I exist, that therein is the challenge. What other reasons could you have to believe something exists without seeing it? Because again, atheists even believe things exist without having seen them. You can note the transitional forms in the fossil record, that we have no actual evidence of Darwin's models that he presumed we would find in time, but that he had no evidence of, and that today are all based on either frauds, artistic renditions of misidentified skeletons, or just outright fabrications. We can talk about people that they haven't met yet, and use the same logic we argued before regarding our own experiences. They can believe that there are, in fact, more than, say, for example, in their circles, a few hundred people on this planet. There are many more that they have never met yet would and could acknowledge that they believe exist. We talked about scientific and philosophical laws. We can talk about dark matter, the thing that they can't tangibly see, they can't interact with, that most of the universe is composed of, otherwise their scientific quote-unquote models for it don't work. And of course, since it's this foundational basis by which they judge, conclude, and examine all reality, despite not being able to tangibly examine it in a test tube or a lab, it's all theoretical, it's all cerebral, it's all in the mind. And while we're talking about the mind, the concept of consciousness in of itself, its effects on the body can be chemically examined, but it in of itself, that spark of life that changes from our bodies and our human persons, is not something that we can scientifically observe. It is simply what's doing the observing for all intents and purposes. We can talk about moral issues, how the foundation of the atheist worldview is more of a self-determined concept that you would rarely find in an atheist so objective as to acknowledge that there is no right and wrong, to go the full Epicurean route and say all things are not permissible, all things are compulsory. I hope not. But the issue is even getting into, say, for example, exchanging poor manners, and to say, well, if you have never met your father, then that doesn't mean that you didn't have one, that whole kind of concept. But we don't want to be that rude yet. The idea, though, is there. And if we ask the question, is something capable of existing apart from you seeing it, we can then tie it back to, so are there more reasons to believe something exists, like God, despite the fact that you again argue, I haven't seen him, you haven't seen him, therefore that's one less reason to believe that he is real. While we've talked about things that even the atheist worldview would acknowledge, can acknowledge, should acknowledge, are real despite not having seen them. And this is where then hopefully you'll get down to more real issues. And the two main ones that are involved in this question of divine hiddenness are mainly centered around the two involved parties that I mentioned briefly while we were praying before the broadcast. First and foremost, the real issue is that there is a nature of God that we are talking about, the kind of God that we believe in, has a relationship-based nature, and that any sort of determining of his actions, his absence, or his presence will, in fact, have its merits and strengths. But ultimately, if we're critiquing the kind of God that we as Christians are going to argue, or that you as an atheist would reject in our belief system, you need to do what's called an internal critique, that when you are examining our ideas, you need to play by their rules rather than misrepresent them or assume that they are functioning like a Greek pagan deity. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. But here's the real issue. We noted the claims and possibilities of this kind of argument and angle, that you can't see something, therefore it's not real, or you have no reason to believe something exists unless you see it. Well, there's two claims that we would make about the God of the Bible specifically. And the first claim is that God's highest priority for mankind is in a relationship. And noting that, then, the second claim is that a relationship requires the free acceptance of two wills. If one is coerced, it's not a relationship, at least not a positive one. And if it is, of course, only by one will, then we would call that a stalking situation. It's not, in fact, a relationship. But the conclusion is, based off of the Christian view of God and given what we'd expect to experience with him, that God's desire for a relationship allows for a second option that his full revelation would make impossible. God doesn't act contrary to his own nature, what he is, so therefore that is our conclusion, that divine hiddenness is in line with his nature because the alternative would invalidate what he is by definition, a relationship-based being. The evidence for this obviously comes from what we would consider an authority on our understanding of God, the books of the Old and New Testament. I'll provide one example from each. In Jeremiah 29:13, we're told, God speaking to his nation, "You will seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all your heart." So in a genre of prophecy, God speaking to his people, Jeremiah is giving this insight into their understanding of God, and noting he desires them to seek him. Notice the emphasis on the pronoun me there, that if this is in fact our effort, our heart invested in him, we will find him, not the other way around. I'm going to find you whether or not you are going to hide. He's already there. Yet in some sense, we note that God allows for the opportunity for those who want him to seek him, with the guarantee they will find him if they desire it. But even noting this in the New Testament as well, James chapter 4 and verse 8 makes the same point in saying, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Not God's already here, so buckle up, things are going to get bright. It's saying what? You make the effort to draw near to God, and you'll find him drawing near to you. This isn't a non-falsifiable position, by the way. It's noting the evidence for our conclusion, our claims, that if God's a relational being, we see the involvement of two independent wills and the opportunity and respect given therein for that will to be accepted or rejected. And if God wasn't hidden, that would be impossible to ignore. So the alternative then is just that. If we have no visible representation of God, but simply get to know him, just like, say, for example, if you were listening to this on a podcast and my only interaction with you is through the transcript of these videos or audio-based, and you can argue, and people have, that this is AI or deepfake, but the issue still stands. What ultimately shows that we are able to engage like this if you haven't seen me face to face? That's the question. There is more than one way for us to interact, for a relationship to form, for trust and the reasons to justify that trust to be established. And if, of course, this is the same for God, does that fit within his nature? Or, as is oftentimes the case in the accusation made for atheists, and we encourage Christians to be prepared for this, is to say, well, you're just working around a very convenient gap in your argument, because unless I see something, that means that it doesn't exist. Well, once again, get back to square one on that issue, and you will have to do this over and over again. But apart from the nature of God, that's the first issue, and the first real problem when it comes to divine hiddenness, is also noting that just like we talked about there being two wills, there is two shoes, I suppose, to tango in this exchange. And if that is in fact the case, we not only have God's relational nature that would make it expected for him to veil his glory in a very necessary way, but also noting the fallen nature of man. The arguments will come in any shape or form. Ultimately, it can be broken down to, if God were to reveal himself to you, would you believe in him? Now, this is a good fork in the road when it comes to meaningful conversations, because if they're honest and say yes, which is usually insincere, it would demonstrate that they'd allow for the possibility of God. But if they say no, that in of itself is an advantage because it proves they're a sincere person, but also at the same time demonstrating they aren't basing their belief on evidence. Now, this is important for the entirety of this discussion, so I'm going to repeat it. If you ask the question, if God were to reveal himself to you, would you believe him? One of two answers, yes or no. Yes proves they are either insincere or demonstrating that they allow for the possibility of God. There's a pro and con. No would prove they are a sincere person. They're being honest about their perspective, but that perspective isn't actually based on the evidence. Whichever way they go, you might be able to be used by God to sow some seeds that hopefully down the road their hearts can be changed by. And my father and our assistant pastor, Boalette here, are both living testimonies to this, that God doesn't give up on people that easily. But that then being said, there are people who, again, from the most scholarly backgrounds to the average troll, atheism doesn't foster an evidence-based worldview, only religious zealotry that passionately rejects any evidence contrary to what they like. You may say this is overgeneralizing, but let me actually give you tangible examples. Peter Atkins on the Unbelievable podcast said when he was asked what evidence would make him believe that there was a God, there's the yes or no opportunity, except given more opportunities to specify exactly what. He considered at first a scientific formula that would be found in Scripture, but then immediately clarified that he would dismiss that as a fabrication, that wouldn't actually do it for him. In a follow-up debate with Dr. John Lennox, he said that there would be no evidence that would convince him that there was a God, and that if he saw the resurrection in person, he would attribute it to hallucinations. He even said in the previous podcast at Unbelievable, if he woke up in heaven, he'd think that he had gone insane. Richard Dawkins, the infamous atheist, was challenged as to what evidence would convince him that there was a God, and he, of course, laughed and said that even if the stars rearranged themselves to spell out, I am God, he would think that powerful aliens were pulling a prank on him rather than considering it a reasonable explanation for the existence of God. In a public Q&A at a college campus, an atheist challenged Dr. Frank Turek that if he were to be shown tangible archaeological evidence that proved Jesus was a real person, she replied that they, them would destroy it rather than continue listening to them. So it shows that, and again, these scholars or activists don't speak for all atheists, but shows that there's a pattern in this worldview that exists. Listen very carefully. If there are any atheists listening, it exists in all worldviews. This is a personality flaw, but cultivated more in some communities more than others. The argument isn't that only atheists do this, but we're specifically talking to atheists that claim that atheism only establishes belief through evidence, that they follow the evidence wherever it leads. And if we go back to the first question, if God were to reveal himself to you personally, would you believe in him? This is why we note caution for our Christian listeners if they say yes, because oftentimes you dig into this and they get into the pattern of, well, that doesn't count as evidence, or that's not proof of anything, or I'm skeptical of that entire field of study. And this is where I want to emphasize to our listening audience some warnings to be aware of as far as red flags are concerned for insincerity, and not wasting your time with people who bring this up, because quite frankly, they often aren't. The first and most important warning is that in atheistic circles, they need to be called out on this immediately. Plain skeptic is not a virtue. Anyone can just demand more evidence and subjectively decide that something doesn't count as evidence if it's something they don't like Atkins and Dawkins. And they, at the same time, will accept as irrefutable evidence the sort of things that people are fabricating in front of their faces. Perfect examples of this are like the Piltdown Man, or articles produced by National Geographic that claim to have found missing links, but were actually just commissioned art pieces based off of scraps of bone in order to say there was evidence for transitional human forms. Evidence isn't determined by what you like, and it would apply the same way. If I said that heaven is for real and Jesus is God and that there's 100% proof and evidence that there is a God, and my only evidence for it is I like what that means, I am in favor of the idea of a heaven, you'd be just as quick to throw this out. But when people who are affirming your worldview, and note again, I will be as plain about this as I have to be, all worldviews do this. All groups and personality types are subject to this. We all have a bias. But saying that it appeals to what you want to be true suddenly makes you the evidence-based person, the objective listener. You are making the same mistake. And we need to be sensitive to that, lest we delude ourselves into thinking that the only way for us to be able to effectively communicate with each other is to ultimately just get into an exchange of slogans until someone runs out of memes and is left frustrated or upset. That's not how communication happens outside of third grade. But if, on the other hand, we want to note the issue of skepticism, the virtue, quote unquote, of skepticism, anyone can play skeptic. You can present me evidence for the lack of existence of God. I will have a negative emotional reaction to that. So, as Dr. David Wood says, I'll lower my skeptometer to absolute zero so that any evidence that you provide for me is not going to be acceptable. But if, on the other hand, my reception, you provide me evidence in church of the existence of God, well, the fact that the pastor's standing up there, I'll raise my skeptometer to 100 so that way anything counts as evidence. Maybe we can reverse the stat as far as culpability, but this is the point. Everyone does this. And anyone playing the skeptic card and saying, well, I'm not convinced in the face of plenty of reason is, of course, just wasting people's time. But if, on the other hand, we put ourselves in a position where we're at least willing to hear out information we don't necessarily like, that may cost us communally, that may has negative implications for the future for us, both for the Christian side and the atheist side, it shows more conviction to be willing to stand on the merits and weaknesses of our own beliefs than to delude ourselves into thinking that we don't need to hear any other voices, because otherwise we shouldn't have any other conversations. Atheists may be able to justify that, but a Christian can't. And that's our calling and opportunity from God, to earnestly contend for the faith, as Jude says. So notice this point. Skepticism. It's an endless train that leads nowhere, and we need to be able to get off of it before it ultimately derails. The second, and this is just as important, and we're seeing it become a lot more popular at the rate that new atheists of lessening caliber and quality are rising up to stardom, criticizing God, quote unquote, is a very broad concept. And what I mean by that is that it's very popular for atheists to claim that every religion uses the same evidence for their beliefs. Thus, if they're able to provide an effective response to something that we would agree with, like responding to paganism or Islam, that doesn't mean that you have categorically debunked all religions at the same time. There are groups that, of course, share certain forms of evidence, but there are others who don't argue the same way. For example, when it comes to the majority of pagan movements, nature worship is mainly the center of this. If it's not, of course, regarding nature, it could be regarding sensations, it can be regarding communal and drug-based experiences, on and on it can go. But if an atheist criticizes a pagan, a version, a view, a treatment of the entire concept of God that is all centered around the claim that nature is based on the whims of the Great Mother or Gaia or whoever you're going to claim is affiliated with these things, you could go to the historical sources and note that these were entirely speculative. You can examine scientifically the causes of this weather phenomenon and note that it isn't in fact divine whims, it can be naturalistically explained. What set the system in order may be something used in argument in favor of other views about God, like, say, for example, Christians, Muslims, and others believe in what's called intelligent design, that the concept of functional nature, that a universe that is governed by order and not chance, not something that fell into place, but something that was put into place in order to function, evidence for things working properly, would dismiss that there is a supernatural mind behind every single whim or action and delegated between this royal family of superheroes, as opposed to, you could be arguing at the same time, all of that evidence, and it would be the same evidence that I would use as a Christian, and saying, yes, God knew what he was doing. I'm not saying that he is the God of the gaps. That's an argument for paganism. But if, on the other hand, you say, I've effectively addressed paganism, therefore I've effectively addressed Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and all the others, that doesn't mean the same thing, because what both categories mean by God are two very different concepts. And here's another important example. In my criticisms of paganism, I'm not enacting civil war between my fellow religious groups. I'm addressing the topic of theism, the belief in God, in the same way that you are, but not negating the whole category. I'm saying there is a right answer, but this is insufficient as far as its explanatory power. This evidence doesn't point to where you think it's leading. I had a debate with a Norse pagan, in fact, from Sweden, and he made the argument, interestingly enough, that there was just as tangible evidence for the gods interacting with mankind, and he references the Greek pantheon, where they have the trident marks of Poseidon set in marble in Athens, alongside the olive tree that Athena herself planted, that, of course, resulted in Athens being named after her. They had a visit from the gods. They chose the goddess of war and wisdom over the god of the seas, and thus the salt mine that he opened up for them ended up being handed off to other groups. But here's the kicker. When I ask the question, compared to the evidence for my understanding of God, we have historical documentation of primary, hostile, and contemporary sources, individuals and groups, friends and foes, all that saw Jesus alive again after his publicly documented execution and burial. Roman crucifixion, for what we know about it, was not something that you survive. Even atheists acknowledge in the Strauss critique that the apparent death theory, that Jesus would have survived crucifixion and they confused it as a resurrection, has to be fundamentally ignorant of what a Roman crucifixion does to the human body. I can use atheist arguments because, again, I'm not granting all of atheism. I'm addressing the category and topic. And in favor of a neutral party, they're still willing to acknowledge the facts. Doesn't mean that Christians can't tell the truth, but between a pagan and a Christian, you could see the merits of having a third neutral party separate from both agendas to remove potential bias. But here's the issue. I argued I can make a trident mark in marble. I can plant an olive tree. I can't convince 500 people at one time that I was alive again after being brutally tortured past my life, having a spear shoved into my heart, and of course left to suffocate for hours as I'm ultimately experiencing the wrath of God, which we can talk about the merits and demerits of in Joel at another time. But that's neither here nor there. The issue is just that. He had to set and acknowledge, well, yeah, but like, how do you know that that wasn't the case? Said an argument from a negative. I said, well, first and foremost, because that olive tree wasn't one that was planted by Athena, that was replanted by the Duchess of, I believe, Spain when the Nazis burned down the last one, and the Ottoman Turks before that, and the Persians before that. We don't know what the original olive tree was, and quite frankly, it is possible for a human being to do this and to, of course, embellish details and say that the god has planted this. How? Not because I dismiss the concept of Greek paganism as before the conversation starts, a priori, but because compared to other evidence, where do I get the reports of Jesus' resurrection from? The eyewitnesses. Where do we get the reports of Athena planting the olive tree of Athens? In the Theogony, who were not witnesses to the events that they were reporting, simply passing down tradition. There is a difference. We talked about the issues with Muhammad historically. We've talked about the issues of Zoroastrianism on several occasions. But the issue is just that. I can't criticize Christianity effectively when I am, of course, using pagan approaches, because that's an entirely different understanding and belief and approach to the concept of God. Thus, the evidence would be different. It'd be like trying to argue against the laws of physics because of the laws of chemistry. There are very different systems in place as far as how things interact at a chemical level and a physical level. They may all be under the umbrella term of science, but you hopefully understand the point. If we're talking about the issue of the question of deity, God, at least allow for an internal critique. And speaking to my fellow Christians, don't allow them to say, I've addressed the concept of God without giving fair shot to what we actually claim about God, because the criticism may not fit the puzzle piece quite as effectively as they think it is if you have basic understanding of what you know about God from a source you have reason to trust. We would say that that's the Bible. And in the same way, divine hiddenness only works if you're completely ignorant of the nature of God, because once again, if God is like Zeus and he's just living up on a mountain, on Mount Olympus and something, we should be able to travel there and physically see them. More modern iterations of paganism have tried to spiritualize it and saying that it was the highest peak and that these cosmic, otherworldly entities, more of an animistic belief, the idea that nature is interwoven with the supernatural, that there is this governing spirit or authority, but they don't interact with this world in a tangible way, except on occasion when something inevitably gets pregnant or destroyed, sometimes both. It's all moot because, once again, it's moving the goalpost, and the atheist and Christian can both argue that. But if, on the other hand, we say, in spite of divine hiddenness, is there reason to conclude that from God? We've already discussed, well, relationally, what's the alternative? God has revealed himself, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, and those interactions had to be extremely limited for the same reason that we say, for example, have heavy security around nuclear reactors. If you were to interact with the one who created the known universe, who had the kind of potential energy to produce, the kind of power that would, of course, fit the kind of descriptions that we get in the Bible, who dwells in unapproachable light, yeah, the emission of radiation's not good for the skin. Let me just say that much. But the point is just that. I can't make arguments if, of course, I'm going to be consistent, and at the same time not grant the kind of category I'm talking to. If we're talking to atheists, we don't say, well, since you believe in a God, why is it that you reject him? No, I don't believe in a God. You're misrepresenting me. Okay, well, since you believe in my kind of God, here's why you're misunderstanding something fundamental. No, the pagan's going to say, I don't believe in your concept of God. Why are you treating me as if I do? If I talk to a Muslim and I say, well, here's the standards for Christianity, he says, I'm not a Christian, you kafir. You talk to Joseph Smith's cults and you just say, oh, well, I'm going to just go lie to you anyway. It's all going to be moot. So here's the point. Different claims, different prophecies, different evidences, different predictions. Call them out on this, because the divine hiddenness principle is mainly based on a misunderstanding of the nature of God, and to address the concept of God is too broad to actually get to the heart of the issue. The third warning, and this is a very, very, very important one, is that know what, as I said before, the Bible actually says about divine hiddenness and historical revelation. Historic revelation meaning, again, to reveal in history, that according to, say, for example, the Exodus, when God revealed his glory in an extremely limited way. In Exodus 20, we're told that the terror of the smoke, noise, and fire would be scientifically comparable to people, again today, interacting with the core of a nuclear reactor. People were shown limited experiences with the glory of God and dropped dead from the experience. We could note Daniel chapter 9 and Revelation chapter 1 for the Apostle John, and were only able to continue because they were strengthened and revived. These kind of encounters were limited because, obvious trauma aside, these men needed that kind of reason to believe who they were talking to, because they were both given very significant information for all of our benefits. If, of course, like we mentioned before, you're going to engage in an internal critique of Christianity to play by our rules to understand what God actually is before criticizing him, you have to acknowledge what we mean by God, a relational being. His priorities aren't to entertain us, nor are they to horrify us. If he knows, and this is key as well, what each person needs in order to come to an objective conclusion about him, he would also know who not to bother when they can't be convinced of anything. The best example of this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, where again, every time he was shown public, geography-changing miracles and signs explained in advance, this is going to be done in order to show that God exists, he dismisses it, he turns to his magicians. Eventually the magicians are like, this is the hand of God, stop messing with this guy, and he still hardens his heart. That, of course, was the point, is that there is a conflict of will that is possible between you and God, which can sometimes involve patience, but also may just be making you a public example. And that's, of course, not what you want to be. A great modern example of this is the founder of the atheist experience and self-proclaimed heterosexual, Matt Dillahunty. Now, we like to call this the Dillahunty Dodge, but his skepticism is legendary, especially among philosophers, because they keep laughing him out of the room every time he is, and this is fortunate, engaging less and less in public debate. The argument is, and he'll say, well, you're straw manning me, because that's all he knows how to do. But he says, God knows what would convince me of his existence. I'm not convinced, therefore God does not exist. The errors in this are plenty, but it's going to be something that a lot of people have adopted in the same way that a Christian would want to quote people like Gary Habermas, Lee Strobel, effective arguments for the Christian faith. So we ought to be prepared for this. And I'm only going to be crass because, again, Matt Dillahunty deserves no respect in this. God isn't obligated to meet standards you've decided for him to meet, because what convinces you isn't conclusive, since it depends on the kind of mind that, first of all, thinks this is an intelligent way of arguing, but secondly, that if they were to apply it to anything else, it would be unreasonable. For example, Matt Dillahunty is gay. If he were straight, he'd know what would convince me of his heterosexuality. I'm not convinced, therefore Matt is gay. He could be as explicit as he wants. I can just reinterpret him as repressing his true feelings, or just say that's what a gay man would do to try to prove that he's straight. It's not falsifiable until I decide otherwise, and that's the issue of the will. It doesn't test or prove anything. It just shows how stubborn is this person going to be before he's so overwhelmed by evidence that he's just going to, as he did in his debate with Andrew Wilson, where we found out his weakness every single time he starts bullying somebody, just bring up the fact that, well, as you heard. Anyway, it doesn't test or prove anything, and this is the point. So, centering around this whole idea or concept, there have been plenty of people throughout history that have addressed this issue. Atheists didn't discover this and then suddenly found their killer objection to Christianity. Wiser men than I have effectively thought through these issues and didn't abandon their beliefs as a result of it. And this isn't because it's necessarily a bad argument, but because, like many arguments that fall short, it's lacking a proper understanding of what we're talking about, which is the Christian's opportunity to inform them about these sort of things. So I'm going to read a quote from C.S. Lewis's book, and again, hope that it will note the most important aspect of this conversation that keeps getting left out when we are discussing these things with a serious, or should I say less than serious, audience. God will invade, but I wonder whether people who ask God to interfere openly and directly in our world quite realize what it will be like when he does. When that happens, it is the end of the world. When the author walks onto the stage, the play is over. God is going to invade, all right, but what is the good of saying you are on his side then, when you see the whole natural universe melting away like a dream, and something else, something it never intended to in your head to conceive, comes crashing in, something so beautiful to some of us and so terrible to others that none of us will have any choice left. For this time it will be God without disguise, something so overwhelming that it will strike either irresistible love or irresistible horror into every creature. It will be too late then to choose your side. There is no use saying you choose to lie down when it has become impossible to stand up. That will not be the time for choosing. It will be the time when we discover which side we have really chosen, whether we realized it before or not. Now, today, this moment is our chance to choose the right side. God is holding back to give us that chance. It will not last forever. We must take it or leave it. Now, let me break this down for all of you, just so that the Christians understand this isn't a slam dunk, own the atheist quote mining that, of course, is going to solve every single problem the atheist gives you. But at the same time, for the atheist, when you hear this from Christians, we want to make sure that we all understand what's actually being argued. What C.S. Lewis is doing is taking three fundamental Christian concepts. First, that of Judgment Day, the passage in Revelation chapter 20, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the different perspectives that people will have at the famous judgment, the last day, the final judgment day. Now, it's not referring to nuclear holocaust, it's referring to when God shows up. Revelation chapter 20 also notes the follow-through from this: when heaven and earth pass away, what you would identify as the heat death of the universe can in fact refer to just the decay and entropy of time, which we can discuss and will discuss in future studies as evidence of the universe having a starting point. And we've discussed in our previous week's study about that being an actual argument for the existence of God. But the issue that C.S. Lewis is bringing up is that when reality catches up with you, the deathbed conversion mindset wouldn't apply here, because it's either the issue of when I say I want to choose when the evidence is plain and right in front of me. C.S. Lewis is arguing at that point it's not a matter of what you choose, it's what you've chose in. That you won't suddenly cease to be who you've spent your entire life cultivating, reinforcing, and emphasizing as your mindset, and then suddenly will do a 180 and change, when it's obvious that, just like with the abuse of skepticism, that isn't always the case. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. If we note that it's not always evidence, it's not always going to be the evidence that starts or establishes us in a worldview, but more issues, which we'll talk about in future weeks, like our social clubs, like our emotional experiences and preferences, like our past traumas and negative association with that of religion, and blaming God for the actions of someone who isn't God. Note the errors in that. It's all going to be brought to the surface, when reality comes crashing down. Not inks up slowly, not is introduced to you at such a steady rate that it boils you like a frog in a tea kettle, but all at once. In an instant, you will be solidified in that position the same way that the moment of death you have had the opportunity over and over and over again, like I mentioned with Pharaoh in the Exodus, and have gotten better at shaking your fist at God or delaying God until a more opportune time. That's why C.S. Lewis also has in mind the author of Hebrews observation, where he says, "Today is the day of salvation. Do not delay as those in the judgment who are destroyed." You had the opportunity to be restored, to be redeemed, to, in this relational being's desire for you, cultivate a nature that at his coming would be rejoicing, but instead reinforced a hardness of heart that would resist the unresistible. And, of course, C.S. Lewis is also making in mind Jesus' parable and says, "The stone on which this falls will be crushed, but anyone who falls on this stone will be wounded." It hurts to have to acknowledge that we were wrong, that we are wrong, that the fundamental basis of the gospel is centered around a confession of sin. But knowing, and this is what we mean by sin, there is a deviation between the moral nature and character, between God and us. There isn't the kind of entity that is just looking for anything other than himself and trying to eliminate it. He purposely introduced a will, a creation, a consciousness independent from him so that it could enjoy his love. That's the purpose for which the Christian worldview says you and I were born. Now, if we choose not to enact that will, divine hiddenness provides the ideal environment for you in line with God's nature and to accommodate yours. But it's not going to last forever. Peter, in his first epistle, made the same point in emphasis, while it is still called today. So that's the point that C.S. Lewis is making. That is the argument we make for divine hiddenness. And with the last minute before our time runs out, I'll just recap the points that we've discussed in as plain a way as I possibly can. First, understand that the argument of "I haven't seen God, therefore he doesn't exist," banks on seeing is the only basis by which believing happens. And there are many things that we do believe exist without ever having seen them. Examples of, again, things like dark matter, scientific and philosophical laws, people and places they haven't encountered yet could take the word of, by faith, the sort of sources that have either taken photographs or given the opportunity to visit someday for themselves. We could note the real issues are, when we understand the nature of God, divine hiddenness makes sense because the alternative would be overwhelming, as other Christian philosophers like C.S. Lewis have observed. But the fallen nature of man, your nature, my nature, are the main obstacle here. And if we want to acknowledge, if God were to reveal himself to me, then I could ask one of two questions. If I say yes, is that because I am allowing for the possibility? Or if I say no, am I acknowledging belief isn't always based on evidence? And that's where ultimately we need to get our heart sorted out, because if, as the Razor oftentimes notes, this is not a kind of gamble you want to leave to chance. This is something we want to know for certain and something that needs to be dealt with from the heart, because it makes all the difference in eternity. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.